Good morning. It is Tuesday morning of Holy Week, and we are gathering together to make our way through the Gospel of Luke. We're inviting folks to read one chapter every day as we follow the story of Jesus once he enters Jerusalem and all the way through his crucifixion and then his resurrection. So yesterday, Pastor Ken led us looking at Luke 19, and today we are looking at Luke 20. Now, basically, there's a lot in this chapter. This whole chapter is about the religious leaders of Jesus' day challenging him. So it's about the religious leaders challenging Jesus. It's about the religious leaders testing Jesus. And a lot of issues come up in this chapter, and I just want to focus on one. So I want to have us reflect on Luke 20, 27 through 40. And here's what it says. Some of the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman and died childless. The second and then the third married her, and in the same way the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died too. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her?" Jesus replied, "The people of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive." Some of the teachers of the law responded, "Well said, teacher," and no one dared to ask him any more questions. Wow, there is so much in this passage that I could discuss. But here's what I find interesting. We all have questions about life after death, right? We all have questions about the resurrection. In our confirmation class several weeks ago, we opened it up for the confirmands and the mentors. What are your questions? And someone asked, in heaven, will we still be a family? Like, I'm married and I have kids. Will we still be a family in heaven? It's an interesting question, right? Like, what will my relationship with Cindy be like? With Micah and Daniel? We all have questions about life after death. And we all have doubts about life after death. See, here's what I find interesting about this passage. A lot of folks look back on biblical times and they say, well, 2,000 years ago, folks were naive. Folks were superstitious. They believed anything. But now we know better because we're modern and we have science and technology. Hey, folks, 2,000 years ago, there were major religious groups that didn't believe in life after death, right? So in this story, if we look at this chapter, we have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Sadducees were a group of religious conservatives who did not believe in life after death. And so they come to Jesus with a scenario that they don't even believe in, just to test him and see how he responds. So it's striking to me that folks back then, just like now, have a hard time believing that there could be life after death, that there could be a resurrection. But Jesus takes this story that they turn on him and he turns it on them. He basically says, I know you're asking about this scenario with this woman who has had 7 husbands because each of her husbands has died and no kids, whose wife will she be in the afterlife? And he says to them, in essence, there is resurrection life. There is life after death. And I got to tell you, just straight out, that's good news for us. Because, I wake up most days and I look for the count. The count of how many have died. At this point, how many have died in America? And there is a knowledge and a way that death is around us that is so palpable. And Jesus is telling us in these words to the Sadducees that there is life after death. And it's interesting the way he says that, right? He goes back to Moses, which the Sadducees were pointing to because there was teaching in Deuteronomy that they're referring to. And he says that in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. Isn't that a striking verse? He's basically saying from God's perspective, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're still alive. From God's perspective, my granny, who lived till she was 107, I've talked about her before, she's still alive. God is still her God. That's a mystery. But that's what Jesus is proclaiming here. That in the midst of these headlines where we are looking at death in a way that we rarely do, there is resurrection life. That's what Jesus is telling the Sadducees, and that's what Jesus is reminding us today. And he's also saying something else that I want to just highlight this morning. He's also saying that our understanding of resurrection life shapes how we live now. See, this is really interesting to me because the Sadducees, they don't believe in life after death. And their take is basically, this life is all we've got, so we better play it safe. See, they're religious conservatives who are very wealthy and who have buddied up with Rome. Like, that's their approach. Like, this world is kind of hard, but we're going to basically get what we can because this life is all there is. And so from their perspective, money is where it's at in this life, so we're going to pursue that. Marriage is where it's at, okay? Having kids is where it's at. They defend the status quo and a certain way of life that's very patriarchal. You notice in this scenario, the wife is kind of a side note, right? 7 husbands, well, whose wife will she be? She's a side note in their thinking. But Jesus turns the table on that. Because Jesus says, and once again, I don't fully understand this, but Jesus says, in the resurrection, there will be no marriage. In the resurrection, we will all be children of God. That's our identity. See, and that has a way of cutting against the status quo. That has a way of cutting against the values that we see in our culture back then and even today. I was talking to a woman in our church just last week, and she said, it's really hard to be a widow. She said, I still think even in church culture, it's hard to be single. And there is a certain way of life that we approach. It's sort of like, this is how you live the good life. And it does kind of include the house and the picket fence and the 2 kids. See, even in this time, the way to live on beyond your death was to have children. That's kind of the approach that's even behind this Deuteronomy verse. We live on through our children. That's how we live forever. But Jesus is saying, no, there is resurrection life. It is a gift from God. And in that resurrection life, we're not identified as married or single. We're identified, each and every one of us, as children of God. And so what I find interesting is sometimes we think that people are too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good. Not sure you've heard that expression. I've definitely heard it. But what we see with the Sadducees is the exact opposite, actually. If we believe in the resurrection, if we believe that there is life after death, we're free to take risks. We're free to take the kind of risks that Jesus took. We're free to say, I don't have to live according to the status quo. My identity is not in how well I keep up with the Joneses. My identity is not in whether or not I'm married or single. My identity is not in all the ways that our culture may identify us or find value for us. I'm free to take risks because my life is in God's hands. And God, in Christ, is granting us the gift of eternity, of resurrection life. And so I'm free to live differently, to take risks for the sake of God's kingdom, to follow Jesus' example, to love courageously, and to live differently, and to not be identified by the values of our culture. So I just want to remind us of that this morning. That in the midst of so much fear around death, Jesus is telling us in Luke 20, God is the God of the living. God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and those who have passed away before us. From God's perspective, I don't understand it. They're still alive. Because of the gift of eternity that Jesus has secured for us. It goes forward and backwards. Because of what we will be celebrating on Sunday morning, there is life after death. That frees us from fear. That frees us to live courageously. That frees us to take risks and to not be defined by how our culture would define us. So let's live with courage today, knowing that we are anticipating Sunday morning, knowing that we have life eternal in Jesus Christ. Let's live with that hope today. Blessings.